Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Sean muy bienvenidos a esta conferencia Cidoc 2023 en la Ciudad de México. Voy a dirigir unas palabras a los tres ponentes en inglés y continuaré la presentación en español. I want to thank all three of you, Stephen, Christian, and Mustafa, because you are going to share with us experience about documentation in archaeology. And we are just starting with this discussion in Mexico. So for us, will be very important, your experience and your knowledge for the applications of standards and the results in the research. So I want to thank you for this experience, for this conversation that we'll have. Continúo en español. Esta mesa se llama Standards del Patrimonio, Heritage Standards 1, y vamos a empezar con una conferencia a cargo de Stephen Stitz acerca de los estándares de Cidoc aplicables a la arqueología. A continuación participará Christian Emil Orr y finalmente Mustafa Al-Sagir, los tres desde la experiencia en la arqueología. So I will present Stephen Stitz, and he will present Cidoc standards applicable to archaeology. Thank you, Stephen. Go ahead.
Hello, good morning. This is really a whistle-stop tour of things that have happened over the last 25, 30 years, leading to the point where Christian Emil will start to talk about. So this is about the kind of stuff that, if you do that, you've broken my slides. Oh, no, yeah, fantastic. Okay. So this is leading up to the point that Dominic was talking about in the presentation this morning, where I can't hold two things. So no.
Or
all right, just
okay.
I asked about this, that's why I asked. So when Dominic was talking, he was talking about the difference between using databases and semantic networks. And what Christian Emil will talk about is the semantic networks. This is all the database background to ways of doing things which are still content-based as opposed to semantically based. So the stuff I'm talking about doesn't give you the polyvocality, the ability to have many different voices present, that the later stuff that Christian Emil will talk about now gives us the opportunity to do. So this really is the background to how we got to the point before we started doing the clever stuff. So I'm going to talk about some common errors that we see in most standard ways of building database structures. And then some of these older ways of doing things. So we'll look at the norm documentaire, which is from the late 80s, early 90s, the Draft Core Data Standard 95 edition, and then the later edition, Object ID, which came out of Getty money, I think, originally, the new archive deposition standard, which is nearly finished, and then the CRM, which sits out, and the period for SORI, which is more a product of the CRM worldview. So what are the common errors that we tend to see in archaeological data recording? The first is that people mix space, where stuff is, and what it is. So an example is an English site, Pretty Nine Barrows, where it's describing the fact that it's in a place and it's some kind of archaeological object. We very often see this in archaeological data structures, that they mix where and what into one field, into one set of structures. We also see people and their roles mixed. So you get Wren, the architect. Wren, great British architect, wasn't born an architect. He wasn't an architect from the moment he was born to the moment he died. He became an architect later in life. And we often see people involved, even with a single building, who have different roles at different parts of their relationship with the building. They start off as a journey stonemason, work their way up to being the architect before their death. So how do we deal with that? We see a lot of mixing material and technique. So we get things like turned wood as a thesauri term, which is inappropriate because you're combining how I do something with what it's made of. We see periods and classifications of site types mixed together. So there are literally hundreds of records in the UK of Roman forts. Two different things. A fort is military site. Roman is a particular cultural period, bounded in space and time if you're a CRMite. And then we see also form and classification mix. So a castle ruin, instead of it being a castle and it being in ruins. So these type of compression is some of the things that Dominic was talking about in his talk. And we have to disentangle that, particularly where we want to disentangle the kind of thinking which is based on colonial, post-colonial, pre-colonial, other ways of doing our documentation. So how have we tackled that? So this is the original standard that I first worked on when I first came to Cidoc in '92. It's a truly appalling standard. It's magnificent in its inability to actually describe archaeology terribly well. It has nothing about anything to do with context, with the ability to talk about stratigraphy, but it's an archaeology standard. It's magnificently bad. So we replaced it with the draft International Core Data Standard, which is based on the Nantes Colloque building and archaeology standard, which tried to differentiate between the names and references to things from where they were, the type of thing they were, so what sort of site it was. The dating was separate, physical condition was separated, and then we had what type of status or protection had been placed against it, and then a more or less free text archaeological summary. Sat under this was what's known as the 4-box model. So here we have archaeological items which describe individual elements of archaeology that we're interested in. This could be a potsherd or an entire site, depending on the scale of the database that you're working with. And then we had archaeological groups, which were sets of archaeological items which had some more expressive power. So the set of elements that made up a round barrow. So the burial, the eco-facts from this buried soil, the mound itself. These were different elements, archaeological items, which when grouped together gave us some more power to tell bigger stories. Yeah. The archaeological items were in somewhere in a physical space, maybe many physical spaces if we're talking about a road that has been broken up into many pieces over time. And consequently, when you build an archaeological group, you also produce a physical group, a set of spaces within which all of the items which make up the group live. So that gave us the basic 4-box model. Now, this was published in '95, so thinking moved on from there, and we get to the current version, which is just about ready to come out finally, which moves to a 5-box model. So we still got archaeological items and archaeological groups giving us that expressive power. We have physical spaces and physical groups. We've lost the link between groups and spaces. You always have to go through the items and the individual physical spaces to get to the groups now. Much cleaner model. But now we've taken out archaeological events. So events are things which have happened in the time of archaeology, not the historic time, the ancient time, but the time of our interactions with the archaeology. The first one of those is obviously our discovery of some item, where it is in the landscape, the first time we see it. So that has a special relationship to the relationship between the archaeological item and the physical space. But events are those things, the excavations, our interpretation, our grouping of things to give us more expressive power, are all described as things that we as archaeologists did. And this fits very well with the latest CRM archaeo model, which allows us to talk about interpretive layers being placed upon physical. So the physical stuff is the archaeological items to physical spaces. And then our interpretation that sits on top of it are the events and the archaeological groups we build from them, in them. So what's new in here? Well, it's very similar. We brought back some of the stuff from the architectural models, so materials and techniques, a bit more on measurement, but otherwise it's more or less the same 7 boxes we saw before, with just an extra bit for materials and techniques and measurements, and persons and organizations being pulled out and made separate. Far more interest in the built heritage to deal with people. Object ID came out in just after the 95 edition. It's now referenced fully. So every element in Object ID is pointed to within the new core data standard, so that you can integrate data sets that have been prepared using Object ID with elements that have been documented in core data standard. Object ID has some categories, all very similar looking, which are compulsory, sort of. Object ID is not for documenting archaeology. It's not for documenting anything, really. It's for telling policemen what has been stolen. That's what Object ID is about. And policemen are only interested in this bit. They don't want to know about interpretation and fun stuff. So the other bits are recommended. They're sort of, well, you might want to think about this, you know, when it's been, before it's been stolen, so that people can find some bits about it. So there's some extra fields which aren't compulsory, but are sort of, hey, that would be nice if you want to write about these things before it gets stolen. So that was the history of content standards, really, for archaeology. Now let's have a little think about, we've dug our hole, we've written about it, we've got a bunch of stuff, and we don't want it anymore. What are we going to do to it? Well, we're going to find a museum and go, here you go, right? Now, our experience in 96 in Nairobi was that people were really, really, really bad at doing anything but dropping off the crate of stuff that they dug up. So you got literally, when we were in Nairobi, they had tables full of beautiful, beautiful hand axes, volcanic glass hand axes. And I said, where are they from? And they said, we don't know. Because some American expedition had dug them up and had deposited them with the museum. And all they had was a cardboard box with a hand axe in with a number on it. No explanation of where, what, anything. So we decided we perhaps ought to have something that people could be belabored with in the event that they dug a hole and they wanted to deposit it. So to go with your license, you need an archive standard. So this is the archive standard. It's pretty straightforward. It's got content and introduction, tells you how to select objects that are going to go into the archive. Not everything needs to go into the archive. And then it goes through how you should do it, the archaeological archive standard itself. And this is a little revolutionary. Most archive standards say, this is what you do with paper. This is what you do with permatrace. This is what you do with pottery. This is what you do with floppy disk drives. Right? We went, well, that's not really going to help in a modern era. So what we're doing is we've said, we're going to break it out so that we talk about the metadata that you need to be able to discover the site and the archive again, what's in it in general. So the archive summary and then the inventory. So what's in what box? Bibliography. How did you do it? You know, what standards did you use? What other documentation processes did you use that go with this archive so that the context of how the archive was generated is understood? And then all of the finding aids. And then we have the documentary archive and the material archive. The documentary archive breaks down into 3 different types of material. I don't care whether it's on a piece of permatrace or a piece of paper or on a floppy disk drive. What I'm interested in is the nature of the object itself, the content itself. So it's either narrative text, which behaves differently to structured text. Tables don't like being flattened. They carry no meaning if I flatten them. So I need a different type of way of holding structured text, and then visual materials, graphic materials, are again a different thing. So within each of these, we talk about the general principles for that area of documentary archive, how to deal with it physically. So if it's on permatrace, do this. If it's on film, do this. If it's digital, do this. And if it's digital, do this. The whole standard is built around anything that we say, everywhere where it needs to be said, it's repeated. So that when you open the standard, you don't have to go anywhere else in the standard. You go to the piece that you want to, and everything you need is there. So it's massively over-replicated as a principle, rather than saying, oh, go and see this chapter to find out how to do this. It's slabbed in. It's easy. It's word processing. And then the material archive, we look at how to physically put it away, and then we look at 4 different areas. Bulk finds, so boring stuff that you get shed loads of, bones, pot, bits of stone, tile, stuff that you get by the box load. So how do we deal with those? Registered finds, which are typically things that we're going to worry about conserving. So metals, organics, anything which is not going to take well to being put in the wrong type of environment. Human remains, which tend to need extra special care because there are lots of very sensible things that we need to worry about. And specimens, which have different requirements because they're not the whole thing, they're part of something. So samples, for instance, organic samples, we would put under specimens. And again, we have 6 different topics within that, which are repeated for each of the bulk finds, registered, human remains, and specimens. So again, slab in the text so that it's easy to consult. Then there's the CRM, which Dominic has already alluded to, and which young Christian Emile here will be doing lots on in the next chunk, which takes you through all of this stuff. But bolted into the back of this is the period thesaurus. So one of the things that becomes very apparent when you start to play with the CRM is that as archaeologists, we're pretty awful at defining what a period is. We all know what it is, and yet none of us agree on it. So what we did 10, 12 years ago is we started working on a way of describing what a period is. So we know what a period is from the CRM definition. So now we need to say this period is for the reign of this pharaoh. This period is from us seeing the start of this technology in the archaeological record to the replacement of that technology with another technology in the archaeological record. So we're defining what it is and pointing back to the spatial temporal extent of it and the references which generate it. And this has been implemented by the team in Texas and is Periodo. If you see that, if you've come across that on the web, this is the basic building blocks that Periodo is built on. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, en español. Aprovecho entonces este tiempo si gustan hacer alguna pregunta, Stephen. Yes. A question, please.
You have to share my microphone. I didn't spit, it's okay.
Hi, Steve. Yes, so I think that the question is towards, of course, Cidoc CRM stands as a in the initial stage where we start describing things, but perhaps if through the archaeological processes, we start defining other data models, other standards to describe things such as periodo, for example, for describing particular times and time and space or periods. So stepping outside a little bit towards from archaeology, and because I want to use your expertise to a wider, bigger spectrum, how do we encourage or establish those pipelines for those specialties of knowledge to be integrated into these standards? Because, for example, a lot of the processes that you're showing is because you have the infrastructure from the Archaeology Data Service, or a lot of infrastructures that allow you to progress with that knowledge. But a lot of knowledge infrastructures are still outside of the ability to generate their narratives. So what is there any kind of suggestion of how do we encourage particular knowledge infrastructures to be part of let's say, how do we integrate other groups into these standards? I think that's the kind of the question. And it steps outside a lot of the archaeology narratives, but I'm thinking of that bigger.
So from 20 odd years experience of integrating data from library communities and trying to get archivists to talk to us, they're very shy archivists, they don't want to come out and play. The biggest thing is to find a group that are interested in collaborating and communicating, who have actual data which contains the semantics of their part of the discipline, of their subdiscipline, of their domain. Because all of the CRM is built by using actual data to look at what are the semantics that are actually being recorded. What are the underlying semantics built into every data model that we see? So we look for the commonalities. So we need actually people to say, this is what we do. Here is our data. Let's explore it so that we can understand what is actually going on, so that they can make that step to taking it apart enough to fit it into an event-centric worldview. But you need people who are interested, have the intellectual spare time, and they need data. Without those two, you're just not going anywhere.
Muchas gracias. ¿Otra pregunta?
We just came from the introduction from the people from the British Museum were saying that to avoid duplication. And of course, one thing of you're saying is duplication is good. So duplication comes with a cost, let's say in terms of energy. And so in terms of preservation.
What duplication? Archaeologists dig a hole and they document the hole that they just dug. Nobody else goes and digs the hole. You get no duplication. Archaeology is inherently destructive. You only get one chance. So,
no, sorry, what I mean is data duplication, not as in. So
if more than one person wants to interpret a site, that is something that we really desperately need. And we need to provide the difference between what was seen and what we think it means. And that's the whole point of CRM Archaeo, is it makes that very, very explicit. And it allows us to be polyvocal. It allows us to have different opinions through time about the same thing. And you can have a colonial view of a particular whole, and a post-colonial view, and a post-humanist view, and that's valid. And we can record it and show it and allow people to choose which one of those interpretations they actually get to play with.
Yeah, that was exactly what I wanted to highlight.
Right.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más?
Thank you. I want to ask about uncertainty of data. How you manage uncertainty?
Well, uncertainty is inherent in nearly all of the data that we produce. it's down to the level of accuracy that you want to incorporate into your original recording practice. So if you're going to dig things with a mattock, you'll get a different level that if you're going to dig it with dental tools. And consequently, your technique, your approach should record at an appropriate granularity to match the techniques that you've deployed in the field. When you get to uncertainty in, I don't know when it was, as opposed to where it was, then the CRM provides for fuzzy-ended relative dating. So dating lumps which have fuzzy ends, and the algebra for that is built into the CRM. So if you don't know when it was at all, but you do know how it is related to some other event that you don't know where it was at all, then you have the mechanism for expressing those relationships, including not having Allen-style hard ends. Although within RKO, we provide you with Allen operator hard ends because there's too much data out there that thinks that way. Does that help?
Muchas gracias, Stephen. Thank you very much, Stephen. Vamos a continuar con la sesión y para ello voy a pedirle a Mustafa y a Christian que suban, por favor. I will ask, please, to Christian and Mustafa to come up, please. Thank you. Okay. Christian Emilor will share with us what is CRM Archeo and some case studies of the application of the standard. Christian Emilor compartirá con nosotros en esta discusión acerca de documentación y arqueología la presentación que es CRM Archeo y algunos casos de estudio de aplicación del estándar. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Christian. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I think I would like to stand as Steve did. I prefer that. And my role here is I've been working with documenting archaeological documentation, so to say. And the last 5 years, I've been working with the CRM Archeo, especially to make it ship-shape for a new version, which will be launched this in a week's time, actually. But I'm also a deputy chair of CRM SIG, and has been working with the development of CRM since 2001. So, okay, let's start. What I will try to do in this presentation is to tell you what CRM Archeo is about, and it may be somewhat technical sometimes, but I will try to explain the main features. First of all, the family of CRM models. CRM has a lot of extensions, and it's now 11, I think. And you see it in the pyramid over there. And CRM Archeo is on the bottom, and it depends on CRM Sci, which is about documenting scientific observations, and the CRM Inf, which is about scientific inferences. And also it is Cidoc CRM and all its extensions are defined as object-oriented hierarchical models. And what is important is that it is event-oriented, so that all actors and objects can be linked via events they participate in or are present at. And it's based on observed actual documentation practice. So it's not invented thoughts that what could be good. CRM Archeo Basic. It's CRM Archeo, the development was based on people from English heritage or historical England, and it's also based on Edward Harris' idea of stratification. So the basic idea is influenced by Harris. The feature of an archaeological site are to be found in the stratigraphic context, which is investigated in an archaeological excavation. And the basic elements in CRM Archeo is physical arrangement of archaeological stratification, events that led to the formation of the stratigraphic situations, activities performed, excavation and interpretation to reconstruct such processes, and the analysis of a relative chronological order in which stratigraphication was formed, and also analysis of human remains and artifacts found within the strata. So a CRM basic is the interface and layer, which again is based on the original work of Harris. And as you see here, a stratigraphic layer is a volume thing, and it's limited by stratigraphic interfaces. And in CRM Archeo, we have two classes, one for stratigraphic interface, and one for the stratigraphic layer, which is called stratigraphic volume unit. And for many excavations, people don't care about the difference between interface and layer. So they use just say that this is both the layer and the interface. And to cope with that, CRM Archeo has a common class called A8 stratigraphic unit, which combines the layer and the volume. And this is a drawing taken from Historical England manual in 2018, and I will use it as a reference thing. It is a post hole. This is a pointer on this one.
Yeah.
Red one, okay. Okay, so this here is a post hole, and you see with the infill and the larger dig out around, and what is in square brackets are layer interfaces, and layers are in round brackets. And what I made a square around is what I've been we'll use as an example. First of all, modeling physical constellations. You have what is number 2 is the infill or the substance of the post hole, and it's again A2 stratigraphic volume unit. And then we have a layer on top of it, but with the interface, A3 stratigraphic interface, and this stratigraphic volume unit fills the interface, fills the remaining of the pole, and then it cuts another stratigraphic volume unit, which is the larger dig out. And finally, it fills also this bigger volume, fills the interface with number 3 there. So this is how we can model physical structures or stratigraphy found when digging. And we use these fills, and cuts and fills are actually instances of a property called AP11 has physical relation. And this can be of type above, fills, cuts, and so on and so forth. And then we go into interpretation and CRM Archeo modeling the creation of the structures. And here we have an image or a painting of the Minoan eruption of Santorini, which is an instance of stratigraphic genesis. And this stratigraphic genesis produced a set of stratigraphic units, which you see as layers in a dig out. So we may combine, you have these physical things I showed you, and then we can add stratigraphic genesises, what produced these physical things. For example, you have another stratigraphic genesis that produced the stratigraphic interface number 19. And we can also deduce that this one, the first one up there, is before the next one. And this can be justified that this one fills the first one. And so we can continue with another stratigraphic genesis and so forth. So here we see a quite complex image with time going from left to right. And the first row is the physical things, and the lower ones are the interpretation of what happened in the past. And in general, this is the mechanism in CRM Archeo for dealing with such interpretation. So we have a stratigraphic genesis making something, and it produced a stratigraphic unit, and another stratigraphic genesis produced another stratigraphic unit, and on top we have the the temporal relation, and on the bottom we have the physical relation. And not finally, but the next is modeling performed activities. In CRM Archeo, archaeological excavations are events, things happening. And it's a class called archaeological excavation, and it is an observation from CRM side. But an excavation consists of many smaller activities. For example, remove of matter, destroy structures, observe, catalog, produce surfaces, and so on. And these smaller events or processes are modeled by a class called archaeological processing unit, which is a subclass of matter removal, observation, production, and end of existence. And this can be added to our picture here by saying that we have on the top left an A1 excavation unit produced a surface with stratigraphic method. And this is the red one called S1, which is an excavation of the post hole, trying to approximate the original surface from the past. And also, you may also model other activities like doing this spit method. Is that the one what to use? Because we call it just by mechanical layers in Norwegian. Yeah. So this is an example of how to model things in the drawing from English heritage. And finally, CRM Archeo is developed as a social process. We need collaboration between many cultural institutions. And many projects, large projects, especially in Europe, has been working on that. One Epoch Ariadne, Parthenos Ariadne Plus. And also, since this is done to model archaeological activity, so it's open to every possible integration and addition that may become necessary as a result of its practical uses or real archaeological problems. And it's intended to be maintained and promoted as an international standard. Currently, it's only Cidoc CRM, which is an ISO standard. So also, since this is a social process, if you are interested, please contact us and participate in the development. So how much time do I have left?
It's okay, time.
Okay, so, yeah. And the other part of my story presentation was to make some use cases. My use case here will be CRM Archeo in a linked data setting, and also an example from Norway, how we have used it in combining archaeological excavations. So as you know, Cidoc CRM is used in many integration projects and linked data. in British Museum, for example, Finnish Archives and Museums, French National Library, and so on and so forth. It's also integrated in Getty's database software, Arches. So you can, if you buy Arches, you can, or purchase Arches, you can use CRM, Cidoc CRM. And there are also other presentations in this conference presenting uses of Cidoc CRM. And if you go to archaeology, archaeology is a specialization of cultural heritage. And it's a wide diversity of archaeological data sets. Integration needs analysis of the data structures found in the data sets and the mapping to a common model. For example, the CRM ontologies and CRM archaeo. And one such attempt is the European project Ariadne Plus, which consists actually of two projects. One from 2012 to 2016 and one from 2016 to 2018. And it involves plus 30 countries in Europe and a huge number of institutions. And the main outcome of this project is a common portal with access to almost 4 million resources. It is a catalog over these resources, which is made in a CRM-based ontology. And it is, the data is put into a triple store, RDF triple store, which can be searched by what, when, where, and terms from AAT, the AAT thesaurus. So it's a simple ontology, and the triple store does not use CRM archaeo. But it has been a feasibility study of relevant ontologies for archaeology, and tools and recommendations for mapping data sets to CRM archaeo has been made. Let me then just return to some principle of data integration. I have 3 levels of integration, and I think the first one is the most important one and the most neglected one. And that is ensure that excavation data are stored properly in an open format for later use. As Stephen said, with this access example, this may not happen. And actually it happens very rare, and that's very unfortunate. This is an institutional or governmental responsibility. I mean, how many, just imagine how much resources are used on excavation, and then the documentation is not accessible because it's in a strange format or it just has disappeared. Then level 2 is that the metadata from all archives should be accessible via APIs and as linked data. This will make it possible for us to create maps and other aggregated overview over known archaeological sites and fieldwork. Ariadne Plus has such a catalog. Level 3 is more challenging. It is that the content of the datasets should be made available as linked data. That is, we have to take each report or each archive for excavation and convert it into some format and put it into a huge searchable linked data repository. Ariadne Plus has currently only a simple catalog, simple ontology, and not CRM archaeo, which it should have been done. But then one caveat, and that is one may wonder if it's meaningful to combine detailed excavation data from, say, Hellenistic Egypt with excavation data from Iron Age in northern Norway, or Stone Age for that matter. So that's an argument against such a huge resource. But then again, I would say that it is not up to us to decide what is useful. That is up to the researchers. And then finally, I will just quickly go through this Norwegian sub-project. In Norway, we have a quite tidy situation. We have 5 regional archaeological museums and 1 semi-governmental organization. But what is, even in Norway, mess can be quite frequent. And since 2000, increasing numbers of excavation is documented in the Swedish system Intrasys, which Stephen knows quite a lot about, and is now a de facto standard in Norway. Intrasys is extremely flexible and consists of a template describing the relation between the pieces of information in a data store, so that you need only to think about the template and not about the data if you want to map the data to Cidoc CRM, for example. And fortunately, in Norway, we have used standardized templates for all 5 museums since 2010. But they develop over time and has regional variants. So what we did in connection with Ariadne Plus was an added project, which the idea was to create a common PostGIS database for around 1,000 excavation databases. And in this database is no semantic data or ontology, it's just a big Intrasys database, to put it that way. But as a side project, which I led, was Ariadne Plus, and that was to map the content of the databases to CRM and CRM Archeo. So how do you do that, actually? This is a part of the template used in our, yeah, that's exactly nice. So we see, you have in Intrasys, you have archaeological object, and then you have subclasses, post hole and trapping pit, for example. And you have an attribute called function and depth and with stick for the trapping pit. And what we do is simply to take this big hierarchy and produce a series of paths through the hierarchy. And so you get archaeological object, post hole function, archaeological object, trapping pit, depth, and so on and so forth. And step 2 is to use those passes to create a context-dependent mapping of each level to CRM Archeo. This is similar to what is done in this 3M tool in Ariadne Plus. So what we get then is, I just made an example, written in words, taken out of Intrasys, an object of the subclass post hole of the class archaeological object with the attributes function with the value roof supporting, and with the attribute describing at date with the value so on and so forth, and the attribute depth with the value 25 centimeters. Now, in CRM, you can, CRM Archeo, the post hole will be a stratigraphic unit, and it will have a type post hole, and the type roof supporting, and the type and the has dimension 25 centimeters. So all this on the top is a very simple mapping. But since you also want to map the date here, it is we have to introduce a mechanism from CRM, which is attribute assignment, which is classification. So this stratigraphic unit, the post hole, was cataloged in this event here and got all these attributes. So that's the way to do it. This can be done quite mechanically, and it's not that difficult. Yeah. So in practice, the mapping is done to an intermediate XML serialization of CRM Archeo, and this XML data can be stored for posterity or be mapped to triple store, for example, by the tool 3M. And finally, the Norwegian project, the structured data in CRM in Intrasys makes the mapping easier. So if you have agreed on standards, then it's much easier to map your data. And also what is interesting is that the mapping process detects inconsistencies in the template and also unused parts of the template. Feedback is sent to the archaeologists and templates are mostly adjusted. Yeah. So that's all from me. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. I ask you if you can stay with us here for the question at the end of the session. Thank you. But you have to change places, please.
No, I have changed mic.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Vamos a continuar la sesión y dejar las preguntas para Christian y para Mustafa al final. Entonces, le voy a dar la palabra a Mustafa para la presentación, documentación para revivir la avenida de la Esfinge. I will give you the word, please. Yes, we have to change. He will operate, he will pass his slides. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Mustafa will present documentation in reviving Avenue of Sphinx. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really great pleasure to be with you today in order to represent our recent excavation in the Avenue of Sphinx. Of course, mainly documentation is the main base of archaeology. We know that archaeology is kind of organized, destructive. So if you lose any data, you will lose the whole story for the site, and you are not able to get the successful interpretation about the site. Just a small introduction that, of course, Avenue Sphinx is in Luxor, which is almost south of Cairo, about 657 kilometers in Egypt. And it is a World Heritage Site registered under the number of 87 in 1979. It's mainly based as capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom, which is almost like 1000 BC, more or less. Ancient Thebes was in the city of Luxor nowadays, which is mainly divided into two parts. The division is River Nile at the middle, and then we can see the eastern bank of the Nile, mainly made of Karnak Temple here at the north, and then Luxor Temple at the south, and connected with the Avenue Sphinx that we will speak about today. And all the Theban necropolis is in the western side. Here, kind of representation, or let's say kind of modeling for the ancient Thebes, the city. Here is Karnak, here is Luxor, Avenue Sphinx, and then if we cross the Nile, we can see the funeral temples and also the royal tombs in the western mountain. Just close to know, here is Karnak, and then Avenue Sphinx start in 2 points mainly. The first point in the west, which comes from the Khonsu temple in Karnak, and the other one is the 10th pylon in Karnak, and then it goes to the south. The first one leads to Mut temple, and the other one connected with the other Avenue Sphinx, leading directly to Luxor temple. In order to know exactly the first documentation in the ancient Egyptian times for the Avenue Sphinx, we can see this scene in one of the tombs in the western bank of Luxor or Thebes, that shows exactly very precise documentation about the Avenue Sphinx. We can see here a road, and then bordered with 2 rows of the sphinxes on the 2 sides, and between each pedestal of sphinx we have a tree or flower or something like this. And then it leads to Mut temple. Here we can see statues of the goddess Mut, and also her lake, which takes like the shape of the crescent, and also we can see the boat of Mut goddess there. So this is kind of the first documentation of ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptians about the Avenue of Sphinx. before we are speaking about the real activities of the work, just to idea to know that this is the situation, the archaeological situation in the middle of, let's say, 19th century. So we can see everything is almost covered by debris because of the inundations comes with the Nile every year. So it leaves layers and mud and also some destruction about the medieval times. And so everything was almost covered till the medium, or let's say the half of the temples itself. At 1949, we have start the excavation in the Avenue Sphinx, so we can see together all the events that had been happening in the archaeological sites. And this is the first time to see the first statue that had been discovered in front of Luxor Temple in the south in at that date. This is the archaeologist who was working there, and then this is the first statue had been discovered in this part. Then later in 1958, the work had been continued to see other statues had been discovered more and more. Others came in 1961. Dr. Mahmoud Abdelrazak also came to continue to find more statues. I don't want to go through the details, but just to show the progress of the work during this time. Also in 1984, my father, he was responsible for the excavation in this time. So also he started to excavate in other part, mainly in the northern part of the Avenue Sphinx, to see other parts. This is the situation in 2006. This is the biggest project that had been carried out during this time. And then I was honored to be supervisor of this work starting from 2017. So here we can see the first part of the Avenue Sphinx comes from Khonsu Temple, this part, and then this is the other part comes from Karnak. So this is Karnak Temple, and then we can see the two Avenue Sphinx goes from the two gates. Then both of them had been connected, and then it goes directly to Luxor Temple, as you can see. And then the Avenue Sphinx, let's start with the one of the 10 pylon comes out of Karnak. This is one of the gates of Karnak Temple. How it was it during the, let's say the 50s maybe. And then that situation it was, and then this is after the excavation. This Avenue Sphinx goes directly to Mut Temple. This is the part where we can find other documentation of the Avenue Sphinx during the ancient times that we already saw just 2 minutes before. And then here we can see a huge statues there had been erected once in front of that gate. And then we can see all the remains of the statues and the pedestals in the two sides of the Avenue Sphinx. Not only one Avenue Sphinx, but also we have branches of this avenue. So this is another avenue comes out leading to the east. We make a documentation for all the kings who participated in this part. So at least we have the famous king Tutankhamun. He was the first one who made the inscriptions there, and then followed by Horemheb. And then we can see that the king Horemheb start to reuse the inscriptions. So he put his name over the name of Tutankhamun, not only Horemheb, but also the king I made the same thing. Then King Ramses III came also to add some inscriptions. And then this is the first documentation for the conservation activities during the ancient times. It had been inscribed by the high priest of Amun, the main god of Thebes during that time, telling that I make restoration for all of the statues in this part. So it's the first documentation about the restoration work during the ancient times. Of course, all of this inscription had been analyzed and studied, and as you can see, had been photographed and illustrated to show also the different phases of use of these inscriptions. Also, we make kind of analyzing for the statues that had been found there in this part mainly, because they are not the same style. We can see some difference. All of them in this part were missing the heads. But here we can see some remains of wig of a woman. And here we can see remains of the nemes or the head cover used for the kings. So here we have a male statue and female statue. According to the archaeologists and Egyptologists who were studying this part, the Sphinx in this part mainly were like this: one king, one queen. And maybe it's supposed to be one of the kings, his name is Akhenaten, and his wife Nefertiti. But as there were kind of problems or religion problems with other kings, so Tutankhamun, when he came, he started to cut all of the heads, the human heads, and then had been replaced with the ram head, as you can see. And then he added a small statue for himself exactly in front of the chest of that statue. So during our excavation, of course, we found all of these statues, or the heads of the statues, that have been fallen down in the Avenue Sphinx. So we found many of them, even with the whole ones of the cobra, which is in front of the head. And then this is the process of discovering one of the statues. In 1999, we found remains of this statues had been fallen down inside the shaft. And then we put some scaffolding this time to put it. And then at the end, we had restored the first complete statue in this part with the lion body and a head of a ram, as you can see. And this statue had been fallen down inside this shaft during the Roman time, more or less. More investigation, and when we start documentation for all parts of that statue, we start to find these strange holes all around the eyes and the mouth. And when we make analyze inside these holes, we found gold inside. So it means that this statue had been covered with a layer of gold, and it had been prepared to receive offerings from the people which are who are living outside of the temple, of course. On the other side, the other gate of Karnak, we can see the remains of other statue, the other Avenue Sphinx comes out from Karnak. And this is the situation before making any excavation. There were an asphalt road, there were some structures disturbing or covering the other side of that part. And then, of course, after replacing these houses in another place, we start to find the remains of the Avenue Sphinx. We can see remains of the heads, and this is after restoration. The third part of the Avenue Sphinx leading to Luxor Temple with a little bit smaller statues. If we compare with the other parts, it consists of lions, lion body, and head of the king. His name is Nakhtanebu I of the 30th dynasty. Of course, the situation was not perfect at the beginning, but we can see that all of these statues had been kind of destructive during the medieval times. The people who were living there, they were pushing the statues, and then they are using this kind of blocks in order to be used in other structures there. And then we found this kind of evidence when we enlarge our excavation at other sites. This is examples for how we find this kind of monuments there. This is after restoration, of course. And then this is part of the Avenue Sphinx that we can see, the original platform or the way, the avenue. And then this is the part had been added later as a conservation, all bordered with the statues all around. As we know from the first documentation of the ancient Egyptians, that between every pedestal of the Sphinx, there were kind of a round base to put some trees or flowers. And then we, of course, when we make the excavation, we start to find this. And all of this kind of flower basins had been provided with a complete irrigation system connected through one of these shafts to bring water or wells. And it all extends all along the Avenue Sphinx, which is almost 3 kilometers long. We can see these pottery pipelines to bring the water of irrigation for this kind of plants, and also another kind of canals made of red brick to bring the water there. We go in front of Karnak Temple, the main entrance, for a while to see that the recent excavation, we discovered kind of big embankment or a huge sandstone wall in front of Karnak. It had been used as kind of a River Nile bank. So this kind of embankment had been built of 17 courses of sandstone blocks. And you can see kind of drawings or reconstruction how the situation was in front of Karnak. And then we found the extension of this embankment and the excavation of the Avenue Sphinx, but of course less than 17 courses, only 3 courses. This is our documentation, so we can see also plans and our survey there. And then also during our excavation in the making the enclosure wall of the Avenue Sphinx, we start to find this kind of steps, which is really kind of strange steps that we hadn't found before, and we found it's going round. So at the beginning we thought that maybe it's the tomb or maybe something else. So we found it that it was a nilometer that can be used to measure the height of River Nile beside this. And this is, of course, the plan that we made after the discovery. All of the objects had been photographed and also analyzed to be to know exactly how it was.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah. Not only an avenue with a sphinx, but also we found other things, which is we found the most complete wine press or wine factory in all Upper Egypt there in the Avenue Sphinx. So here we can see the 2 examples. Mainly this part is the part where they put the grapes, and then the people are pressing on this grapes to receive the liquid or the juice. And then here we can see the filter, and it had been stored in a room underground to be fermented and then can be used during the festivals. It doesn't work. Yes, okay. Yeah. Another documentation of ancient Egyptians showing how the let's say making the wine, they are bringing the grapes and then they put in this kind of place, and the people are pressing on it and to receive the juice or the liquid, and then they stored in kind of pottery jars. This is the place where is the all of this wine press, the 2 wine press exactly beside the Avenue Sphinx. Here also, this is the place where the grapes had been washed before they had been pressed, and then this is the storerooms where all of the pottery jars are there. One of the most important discoveries there in the Avenue Sphinx is this stela. It had been found there, and then when they start to move it, they found it's inscribed, and we had that stela which is dated to the king Setnacht, and all things that we know about the king Setnacht, that he is a king of Egypt for only 2 years. But this stela start the text with the 4th year of King Setnacht. So this is a documentation of the ancient Egyptians showing that King Setnacht had been ruled at least for 4 years. And also it had been saying like there's kind of problems inside Karnak, and then he controlled everything. The last discovery that we found in the Avenue Sphinx is under the gate of Karnak. While we are cleaning all of this part, we start to find this kind of blocks, and this part looks like kind of had been reused block. So this is one of our documentation work to show kind of 3D modeling and photogrammetry for all of the archaeological situation there, showing the archaeological situation in this part mainly. So here, this is the blocks that we are speaking about. And after removing them, we found that they are on kind of remains of other shrines erected for the Holy of the Holies of Karnak. It had been reused after this. Of course, at the end of this project, we had the official inauguration of the Avenue Sphinx in a big festival. Mainly, Avenue Sphinx, of course, we found. But what about the use of this Avenue Sphinx? It had been used during the ancient times in mainly festivals. So it was a great processional way, more or less. According to the documentation that we found in our monuments in Karnak Temple and Luxor Temple, and also with that we found that all of these festivals had been continued for even the medieval times to an Islamic sheikh. His name is Abu al-Hajjaj, and then they were celebrating kind of his birthday with almost the same rituals made by the ancient Egyptians in Tawbet Temple. So we have a quick comparison between, or the similarities between these three events, let's say. So this is the ancient Egyptians, how they celebrating this part using the candles and the processions. This is how they are using in Abu al-Hajjaj celebration, and then how we made during the official inauguration in the Avenue Sphinx. Here we can see also the bark of Amun, or the boat of Amun, holding by the high priests, and then exactly the same park in Abu al-Hajjaj and how it was during the official inauguration. Using the sticks is also one of the most important things in the all parts. And I would like to show you a quick movie that you can see the similarities between all of this according to the documentation had been done in the ancient Egyptians, and then we can see that it's still going on. So without documentation, we were not able to know how it was, everything happened. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. And thank again, Stephen, Christian, and Mustafa, recognized archaeologists from United Kingdom, Norway, and Egypt, who have shared with us the application of the standards in archaeology and who can open with us the discussion in Mexican archaeology. Muchas gracias, Stephen, Christian, Mustafa, por compartirnos estas experiencias. Ellos son tres reconocidos arqueólogos de Reino Unido, Noruega y Egipto, quienes nos han compartido experiencias de documentación, ya sea en la reconstrucción de los procesos históricos, como en los procesos de documentación de investigación arqueológica de excavación. Tenemos unos minutos para hacer unas preguntas, entonces los invitamos a hacer preguntas a Cristian, también a Stephen, si quedó alguna, y a Mustafa. Muchas gracias. Gracias.
Hola, para Mustafa, por favor. La pregunta sería, a partir de la documentación de todas estas evidencias que encontraron en los fragmentos, quisiera saber si el estado de conservación o alguna de las alteraciones o deterioros en estos fragmentos que encontraron también fue un precedente, un recurso de información que permitió construir todo este escenario que pudo ser replanteado a través del vestigio. Entonces sería esa la pregunta, si alguna forma del deterioro del estado de conservación también fue documentado para poder sumar a la parte de la reconstrucción.
¿Podría repetir tu pregunta? Sí, porque... Based on the documentation process. If there was any deterioration on the fragments that were the object of the study. Added up to the recreation of what you just showed us on your video and your presentation.
Okay, of course, that the documentation for we make documentation for all the steps of the work in the Avenue Sphinx, not only for excavation but also studying all of the objects and the blocks, all the inscribed things. Moreover, that we also make documentation for the conservation intervention in the Avenue Sphinx. Many of these blocks, of course, were not in the good conditions of preservation, and also we make kind of conservation for all of them. Some parts had been replaced with other new ones. All of the blocks had been in a very bad conditions, so it had been replaced with the new ones, but of course with the limits that we have to deal with according to the principles of UNESCO and others. We had a kind of complete system of recording, especially for the blocks, for pottery, for archaeology, and I mean all things that all finds that we can see. We had this system, and we're still working on this, especially that the excavation is still going on seasonally, not all the time. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. ¿Otra pregunta? La última. Alguien que se anime. Okay. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you very much, both of you, as well as Stephen. Please. Vamos a tener un muy breve receso. En 10 minutos comenzará la siguiente sesión de estándares del patrimonio 2. Entonces podemos ir brevemente a tomar un café. Muchas gracias.
En la tarde no voy a estar yo, pero le comento al chico para que tú te vas a estar tú ya. Ok. Entonces ya se las cogí acá, pero todos mis ahorita yo ahorita le digo se llama Alberto, él viene en la tarde y para que también sepa. Yo voy a estar todas las mañanas y todas las tardes. Y entonces, ahorita algunos de ustedes conocen a ellos para ¿qué es eso?
Ya hemos visto varias veces de esa.
Ah,
Now we're doing part two. There we go. So it's all straightforward. We're going to start with a presentation on interoperability between the Tynacan Digital Repository and the Information Network's Wikidata and Wikimedia Commons, a case study from the Museo Paulista. And it's going to be double teamed between Dalton and Solange. Over to you.
Well, hello again. I'm not make a presentation of museum, but because I just have done this, but just to say that our museum, it's an old building, and then we stayed closed for 9 years from 2013 until 2022, preparing the museum for the bicentennial, because the museum occupied monument dedicated to independence. It was not to be a building for a museum, but a building as a monument. And then for this period, we take off all our collections. The educational activities were transferred also for other buildings. And the building that is the place for the exhibitions and the educational activities was closed. And this put for us a great challenge, because we are a museum, a university museum, with a lot of researchers that need to have access to our catalog. And then also we think that to be out of the scene for 9 years, or because we know that the process of restoration and all the modernization of our facilities for the reopen to the bicentennial, we belong. What's something very strange too, because no exhibitions, nothing. And then in 2017, we were called by João Pechansky, that was the coordinator of the Wiki Movimento Brasil, the Wiki community of Brazil, with the proposal to diffuse our collections and create a page, a Wikiglan page. And we saw the opportunity to be in touch with the public and to diffuse our collections in a Wiki platform. Well, I really don't have the exact idea what it means, because okay, we treat our data for this, and then we start in 2017, and then just a moment, we established this partnership between Museu Paulista and Brazilian Wiki community, and then we created the Wikiglan Museu Paulista da USP. Well, from this, in 2021 and 2022, we could promote a lot of events like this, so marathons, that's very typical of Wiki community, in order to improve the entries of the Wikipedia. And then we choose, treat our collections and like subjects like indigenous in paintings, women artists, São Paulo, the collection, the photograph collection of São Paulo, independence visual narratives. So subjects that were of importance for us in the museum, and a way to promote our collections and put this in contact with the society was one of our demands and our goals. No? And this is our numbers by now. We were in Wiki since 2017. In each month, we have the numbers of visualizations and how our collections are being using in projects, in articles. And we have a lot of improvements also in our data, because in fact, our database is an old database. We are for the last 30 years working in a database with many things that is not completely correct or need to be to add information. And at the moment that we put this in our own week as week data, we are receiving a lot of improvement from society. You know, it's a kind of, in generally speaking, a kind of sharing curatorship, because we can receive and we can see this change in some data that was in the Wikidata. So the question that we are putting for us is how to have this new information that is on Wikidata platform in our database repository. And then when Dalton start to work with us with this project.
Hello to everybody. It's looking at this those numbers. We have some very specific problems and very specific opportunities that we can imagine from there. We have more than 21,000 usage of these media files in articles in Wikimedia. But how the museum, which has, we presented right now at the last session, we present the migration from the whole information of the museum to a new digital repository. So the museum has a digital repository and has a software to organize and to manage all the information. But the museum published this information on Wikimedia. It's a very hard task to follow up what is happening on Wikimedia and how can I collect the contributions, the translations, the improvements of metadata information, and reuse this information on the digital repository in a new way, or incorporated this information on the digital repository. So we began our research. We began try to find how to integrate the both systems, how to integrate the both information ecosystems, considering that we have a digital repository on one side and we have Wikimedia and Wikidata from the other side. And we arrived at this concept, which is called in our community, the concept of round tripping. Round tripping, it's a very nice concept, and we have here a general vision. So we have in one side Tainacan, which is a free software. Tainacan is a plugin for WordPress that transforms WordPress in a digital repository with the whole functions that you need to organize, to publish, and to manage your digital collections. But the idea is to publish media files directly from Tainacan to Wikimedia Commons and to receive in an automatic way the revisions, comments, traductions, and file usage statistics inside your digital repository. From the other side, we have Wikidata. Our idea is to publish directly from Tainacan to Wikidata and to receive at the same time the revisions, the new statements, introductions that could be produced by the users from Wikidata. And one which is the most important of these ecosystems, the reuse of files and the reuse of metadata in Wikipedia to create the info box, to use the digital media to illustrate new entries on Wikipedia, and collect the reused statistics on Tainacan. So the idea is to transform Tainacan in a whole tool, in a whole software to use and to send and receive information from the Wiki ecosystem. So we began our research and we found some references, some very interesting and very beautiful references that mention, at least once a time, this idea, that mention that it could be possible, this is a desirable new features that the softwares could incorporate, but we don't have a time, at least we don't know in our group, in our team in Brazil, any digital repository software that has already developed these functions. So the first reference is a very beautiful, and if you are interested in this theme, I suggest you to go to these reports. It's 3 reports created by the Wikimedia Commons team from Sweden. This team, they make a research, a whole research, to try to understand what needs to be done to arrive at this technical solution? How we can develop the round tripping solutions? How we can do that? And they write these reports, they develop some pilots, experiments, and at the end, they don't have a solutions already implemented, already done, but they created and they developed many technical considerations and conceptual considerations that we need to listen and need to learn, and we learn a lot with this work from the people from Sweden. The second reference is a paper published on Museum on the Web in the 2019 that has, at least in a very abstract way, an idea how from a database, from a museum database, we can send metadata to Wikidata, media to Wikimedia. The editors could work on this side. This information could be reused on Wikipedia, and we can receive information from the other side. So this idea is something that's not new. It's clear about this reference. But we have some people working on the conceptual model, how to create that, how we need to consider it. And the third reference is a blog post from Sandra Falconier, which mentioned the same idea. We have the institution here, send information to Wikimedia, Wikidata, and receive information from that. So we have the idea, we have the references, but how to implement that on a real situation? We have 4 big problems in our research, considering 4 big steps to solve when you need to develop a technical solution for that. The first one is the reconciliation of metadata values. You have so many information on your digital repository, but if you are sending this information to Wikimedia and the most important, to Wikidata, we need to consider how to create a reconciliation process in considering that you need to identify not just the properties, but the entities that are mentioned in your database and that they are already mentioned on the Wikidata database. The second problem is the data publish workflow. How you will create your items, and I'm saying that how you send your digital media files to Wikimedia, create the items, put the basic metadata information on Wikimedia Commons, and create the metadata on Wikidata. So we need a workflow from data publish, originated in one side in your digital repository, and send information to the other side to the Wikimedia systems. The third problem is monitoring and a workflow of monitoring the editions and the collaborations. If someone translated a metadata, if someone created a new property related to an item, how I can discover that in an automatic way. And the fourth problem is monitoring the reuse, how people are using our data, how people are using the images, how people are using the metadata to create info box on Wikimedia, on Google, and all of that. So considering these 4 big problems, we organize our research team, we organize our research effort to create a model, and this model is already being implemented. We have some pilots working. All the pieces of this model that I'll show you are working right now, but are working using some Python scripts, using some APIs. We are putting all this together on the same solutions right now. So what we have here, we have Tainacan from one side, and we have Wikimedia Commons from other sides. Wikimedia Commons has an API. So it's very simple. When you can study the Wikimedia Commons API, you can discover how you can send, Tainacan has an API already, how you can send media files and metadata to Wikimedia Commons. But one thing that was for us a very important discovery, I mean, in a technical sense, not in a conceptual sense, is that Wikimedia Commons has a wiki-based media info plugin. So you can keep syncing your information from Wikimedia Commons to Wikidata using this plugin that was already developed by the Wikimedia Foundation. So I don't need to send information from my digital repository to Wikidata. I just need to send information to Wikimedia Commons and pass like a technical way from Wikimedia base info plugin to Wikidata. And I can keep a conversation between the both systems just using this technical path. And what we can do in the other side to create the experiment of round tripping, I can recover from Wikimedia Commons, from Wikimedia Commons API, informations about pages that mention our digital objects and Commons metadata. In Commons, we have a section, very simple, but we have a section of metadata information. But using this plugin, I can recover information from Wikidata, and this information keep us syncing between the media files that we have here and between the metadata file information that we have here. So what we develop in Tynacan, we develop some PHP models that implement the syncing between the both APIs, and we develop using Python scripts. We develop a solution to keep the information, to create a reconciliation process from the information from Tynacan into Wikidata, passing from Wikimedia, Wikibase Media Info plugin. So we are putting this all together, and our expectation is to deliver this as a functionality working in Tynacan by the beginning of the next year. So you can use Tynacan, you can experiment Tynacan as a way to publish, as a way to keep your information syncing with Wikimedia Commons and Wikidata. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention.
Questions? Where's the microphone?
How do you sort the information that you are receiving to adapt it to the fields that you already have in Tynacan, and to discriminate if you are discriminating some info or not? I don't know if I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, we have a control panel from the people from the museum that they can follow up all the information that they are receiving from Wikidata and from Wikimedia. It's not approved automatically. You need to do some revisions because you can agree or not with some contributions. You can agree or not with some translations. And the fact is, we have a control panel, and the people from the museum then can follow up all the contributions and they can approve. If it's approved, we have a new metadata section related to this item. And in this section, you can see information coming from Wikidata, information coming from Wikimedia. So you know that this information was not created by the museum. This information was created by a popular and a common contribution created on these different systems. And we have the link to go back and to see the information in the original place. Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Silvia Gutierrez from the Wikimedia Foundation. So I'm so happy to see this presentation. I was wondering, so the Met Museum, when they paired with Wikidata and Wikipedia, they saw that they could, improve, what is this, like information in many languages. Are you also thinking in multilinguality when you're doing this round tripping, so you can have metadata in multiple languages?
Yes, we are working on that. It's a very huge question for us because what I will try to explain what we are waiting for. WordPress is passing by a new reformulation considering the possibility to implement multilingual websites. So when WordPress changed their core software, we can take advantage to use their solution on your plugin. And we are waiting for, we are following up the developers from WordPress. They are discussing that. They are conceiving the way to do that. I think in something more than 5 to 6 months, we will have some implementations of these new technical possibilities, and we will adopt that on Tainacan. And this could be a very interesting thing that we could collect information from the translations from Wikidata or Wikimedia Commons and present in Tainacan in a multiple language site. I think it's a possibility for the next year.
Well, thank you very much for an interesting approach to polyvocality. So now I'll introduce somebody's name. What's in a name? Applying CRM for museum context. George is going to do this. This is George Brusiker with a glass of water.
With a glass of water. Not drinking it while speaking though.
Oh, I'm disappointed. I'm guessing that I'll see your lips move as well.
Oh, hello. Thank you.
I've been labeled.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, George.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. I think I'll come over here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that the keynote this morning was build up to my topic. I definitely want to speak in the frame that Dominic Oldman opened with his opening address. So I want to talk about describing complex social facts and how we can deal with them in museum contexts using an extension of the Cidoc CRM semantic standard called CRM AAA, or Art and Architectural Argumentation. In my talk, I'll present some images and some concepts that are probably can be offensive or a matter of contestation. It's not meant to offend you, but to say that we have to be able to talk about these things and to what extent we can manage that using an ontology describing real museum data. So without further ado, maybe. Okay, I've gone to, how do I go back? Okay, well, we skipped one. It doesn't matter. But I don't know how to advance the slides. So okay, the left and right. Okay. Okay. Okay, well, keep skipping one, doesn't matter. I had, this is an image of a cultural object found in the Yucatan. It's a tree of life, and it's been an object of cultural contestation over the centuries. So if you were to put a type on it in a museum documentation system, you might call it a ceiba tree, or you might call it a cross, because the local populations originally interpreted it as a tree of life, and later on the missionaries adopted it as a symbol of the cross, and now it's a contested symbol that there's much to talk about and has great cultural value to understand that historical context. This is a totem pole from some First Nations people in Canada that was transported to the Swedish National Museum of Ethnography and lived there for many decades. And then there was a fact-finding mission by those by members of that community, and they discovered that it was indeed their totem pole, which they never ceded custody although the Canadian government did on their behalf. And so, again, we have an interesting, complex history of an object that we'd like to be able to talk about in the presentation of this information to the public. So I think we face a sort of issue of museum documentation in an era of evolving norms. And so I pulled some quotes from the version 6.2 of the Statement of Principles of Museum Documentation. And on the left-hand side, we basically see the requirement and the suggestion of the Cidoc community that you should gather some objective facts that will help people to understand the main information about a museum object. But there is a sort of implicit assumption that there's an agreed set of universally accepted and objective criteria for documenting things like names, type, and provenance, for example. And as I tried to suggest with the previous illustrations, that is not necessarily the case. The name of the object cannot be agreed upon, the basic classification, certainly the provenance. And I think, of course, that the principles actually already looked forward to this, as it says that the museum should evaluate the needs of its users and provide appropriate services tailored to different categories of users, researchers, teachers, students, learners, and the general public. So I think in the context now, where previously marginalized or continue to be marginalized groups and other perspectives are being invited into the museum and to speak for themselves for their own cultural heritage, we need to be able to face what it means to try to provide this objective information, which involves the perspectives of different communities and their objective views. Now, I am mostly specialized in doing semantic data. I'm not a museologist, so I want to talk about this in the context of the Cidoc CRM standard, which is a semantic data standard for making it possible for museums and cultural heritage institutions to translate their original data into a common framework of information that allows it to be integrated and compared. Now, given the context of this newly opened vista of perspectives from different groups, this is something that Cidoc CRM should have within its scope. In fact, Cidoc CRM, as you can read on the slide, already does make a commitment to being able to integrate a heterogeneous scientific and scholarly documentation about the human past at a human scale and the available documented and empirical evidence for this. So that's already within scope. The question is, how well can we manage it? And I think to an extent, because of the origin of Cidoc CRM as an abstraction over traditional museum inventory systems, as Dominic was referencing in his talk, the information that it can handle is really oriented to support that mission of providing the objective facts that you can find in the physical world of this happened here at this time, etc. But it's not geared towards talking about these new issues we want to talk about in terms of who thinks at what time that such and such a thing has such a name, such a classification, such a provenance history. So I basically want to point towards the same point that Dominic was making, is that we're not simply interested in museums in collecting material facts about objects, but collecting those in order to be able to document and make a conversation and an argument over the social facts, the meanings that are imbued on and related to particular objects and what they mean to different communities at different times, and how we can share our experiences and have a rational argument over these objects. So researchers and documentalists aren't just interested in the latest best state of knowledge, so dropping the old title and adding the new latest best title, but keeping a provenance of knowledge of how our perspectives on objects and facts have changed over time. So then the question arises, how can we attempt to meet this challenge in the semantic world? And in meeting that challenge, the main problem is that the point of the ontology is to try to allow integrated facts that everybody can say, those are real facts. We may not agree that they're correct ethically or whatever, but they are the case that they happened. So we don't want to allow data poetry and everyone to say whatever they want, but we want to be able to find a way of representing social facts in an objective way. And so in the fundamental research we did for this extension to Cidoc CRM, we borrowed from the philosopher Searle and his work in the work Construction of Social Reality. And I'll just quote him. He says, "There are portions of the real world, objective fact in the world, that are only facts by human agreement. In a sense, there are things that exist only because we believe them to exist. I'm thinking of things like money, property, governments, and marriages. Yet many facts regarding these things are objective facts in the sense that they are not a matter of your or my preferences, evaluations, or moral attitudes. The question that has puzzled me is, how are institutional facts possible?" And so Searle's answer to how institutional facts are possible is his proposal of the idea of collective intentionality. And that builds on his work in intentionality, so we'll get philosophical for a moment. But the idea is that objects aren't there normally in a dumb fashion, and they're just available as being the cup or being the projector. Objects are always already interpreted, and we're always taking them in some way in a social context. So Searle's formula is that we take, have I written it down? We take X for Y in context C, but the basic idea is that we add an interpretation onto an object and we see it via that interpretation. Now that can happen at an individual level, and that would be subjective, but we have an ability to imbue collective agreements on how we interpret an object, and that's what he calls collective intentionality. So the notion of collective intentionality is something that he then tries to link to, well, how does this collective intentionality come about? How do we all attribute the same meaning to object X, or at least how does this group all agree to attribute this meaning to object X? And he borrows from even earlier in the philosophical tradition, a philosopher named Austin, and Austin introduces this idea that words aren't only used for describing an objective reality, but there's a function of speaking which is created in order to create new facts in the world, these new social facts. So he calls these particular moments of using words to create new facts, speech acts, and the characteristic examples of these things are marriages, baptisms, promising, and these sorts of things. So there is a moment when we execute a sort of ritual, and if we follow the rules of our society, then it imbues a new meaning onto objects that is now an objective meaning that we all abide by until such time as we decide to undo it, a divorce, a change of name. So CRM AAA adopts those things in order to try to provide an extension to Cidoc CRM that plays with the basic perspective of Cidoc CRM of preventing the objective representation of the agreed facts, but adding in a new element called the institutional fact, which allows us to document how people at certain times took an object to be. So that's what I would call a social fact-oriented ontology as opposed to an event-oriented ontology. And it connects back to the event-oriented nature of Cidoc CRM for those of you who are following the Cidoc CRM workshop, etc., via this notion of speech acts. So speech acts are events which cause these facts to come to be. So it wouldn't be a Cidoc CRM talk if there weren't some diagrams. So here's a diagram, and in the middle of it, you can see this notion of institutional fact. So it goes back to that formula of Searle's that we take X as Y in context C. So we have something that collectively we take to be the case, and we take it to be the case for some object, and we attribute it to have some new value. So that's the has subject, which is the thing that we're ascribing value to, and has target, which is the value that we assign to it. The interesting thing about this new node in the representation is that it's not an event, but it's a temporal phenomenon, a state of collective thought that has temporality. So we can talk about how long did people take this to be the case, and when did it stop? And we can talk specifically about which group held that, and then start to ask questions like why. So that's one part. The other part is the speech act. So this goes underneath the basic event class of E7 activity in Cidoc CRM, but it specializes it, and it gives some new properties that allow you to talk about how an event initiates the fact that some group takes X to be Y for some time, and what terminates that. Another event can terminate that same belief. And there's other elements of a speech act that are very important, so I won't go into the philosophical details, but to do a speech act properly, you have to invoke a rule. You have to invoke that rule properly. So if you're in a marriage, for example, you have to have the priest present. The priest has to have the marriage license. You have to do it in a certain amount of time. Otherwise, the fact doesn't come to be. So that's what the speech act node allows you to represent, is that you're pointing towards the rules that are or are not properly invoked in order to create a fact. And so I'll go through this quickly so I can show one example. So I just want to say that what we did with CRM AAA was first do that sort of fundamental research to think about how can we represent social facts contextually. And then we did an analysis of Cidoc CRM, and we looked for those things that are already in CRM, which are represented as simple physical facts, and looked how we could create an extension that would allow you to have an alternative representation that would represent the more complex cluster of information around simple facts like, or seemingly simple facts like names, classification, custodial and ownership status. So there's 12 different social fact types that we identified in Cidoc CRM, which we've allowed a richer representation of. And then we created a bunch of subclasses for specific types of explicitly declarative acts. So for example, Cidoc CRM takes a more general top-level view of something like acquisition, where it's a physical phenomenon. So it doesn't take into account the inner initiative of people to do something. So a real instance of acquisition is to lose something or to have it stolen from you. And that's true to the class acquisition, but there's a subset of instances where you want to talk about real legal acquisitions and you want to follow up. It follows this law, it didn't follow this law, et cetera, et cetera. So we've created that infrastructure as well. And I'm going to at least give one pretty picture towards the end. I just want to say that this is very useful in practice and facts. So 3 examples we have from projects we actually work on are Parks Canada, German Institute of History in Rome, and the Max Planck Institute of History of Science in Berlin. For the first case, they're a national body that's responsible for documenting the classification of people, objects, or events as of national significance. And so that's very important, the processes that lead to identifying a certain person, event, or object as being of national significance. It goes to ministers, there are protocols that are followed. So it's really a place where you need to have the ability to document the details of a speech act, and the fact that we assign this value to this individual at some point, and later on, because our values might change, we unassign that value because we don't believe that anymore. And this is a particularly strong system for doing that. It's also very flexible. We're working on a project on early modern slavery, and it's catalogs contracts that lead to the enslavement, the emancipation of individuals. And then the contracts involve obligations of money. Thank you. And so all of that, again, is a complex set of relations, which this sort of additional modeling is very helpful for. And we're just opening up a project with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science on their institutional and prosopographic history. So who worked there and where they came from, what their roles were. And again, this ability to talk about who had what status within the organization for what time, etc., is a very valuable thing to be able to represent. So I'm gonna, with my 15 seconds, I think, Steve. Okay, I'm gonna open up, hopefully this will open on the internet, we'll see. Oh no, wait. Oh no. Can I be taken back to the presentation? Indeed, I feel like a child now on a Windows computer. Oh, the PowerPoint. Okay, I get it. Next, the other one. Oh, I can get it now, I understand. It's not this one, it's the one next door. See. Okay. Oh, it doesn't want to open that link anyhow. Okay. Sadly, I had everything in Draw.io, and I can't put that into this slide. So I'll just give you the description of what goes on. There was a very, there's been an ongoing problem with reconciliation in Canada, and a long negative history of our relationships with the Indigenous people. And 2 or 3 summers ago, there was an uncovering of a discovery of potential mass graves of people in a forced residential school for First Nations people. And the result of that was a lot of questioning in Canadian society. And there's a metro station in my hometown, Edmonton, that was named Grandin. Grandin was one of the proselytizing early missionaries. And we used to value him as being a Canadian hero, and we do not really anymore because of subsequent documentation found about his role in the repression of First Peoples. And so via CRM AAA in a graph, which again, I can share with you outside of the meeting, you're able to trace this sort of history of the first naming of the station, that the Edmontonian public took the name of this station to be Grandin, and for that to be good for some time, and then document the renaming and the motivation of the events that led to that renaming. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Any questions for the not quite so arm wavy George Brewster? Oh, that man there.
Thank you very much for that presentation. John Sell's one of my great heroes. It was wonderful to hear you talking about him. I was wondering about the whether what did you call it? An institutional state or something like that, that entity, which, as I understood it, correct me if I'm wrong, documents a period, as it were, of a state.
A state, yeah.
A state, yeah. I can remember in a CRM workshop with Carl Lugosi years ago, having an argument about this because Carl Lugosi, who's from New York, was putting forward a model based on states. And we were arguing with him about it and came to the conclusion that it wasn't necessary to have states. By analogy with moving something around, you say this object is located here at the moment, but we can't, if we document that as a state, we've still got to say, when did it get there and when did it leave? So you then need two events to say the start and the end of the state. And in fact, the state saying this thing is here now is not very useful. It's just being observed to be here, but we don't know when it came here and we don't know when it went. So I'm just wondering whether you need actually that state entity when you've got the speech acts that document the beginning and the end.
Thank you.
Is it redundant?
Thank you for the question. So I definitely argue it's not redundant, but the conversation is open. So it's definitely heterodox to Cidoc theorem to have a state class, and I've specifically limited it to intentionality for human beings rather than talking about physical states, etc., which is another ball of wax. And my argument for having to represent the state explicitly is that it comes from the historical research that many times we do not know the opening speech act or the end speech act, but we do know at some point it was the case. And so it gives you the ability to capture whatever level of knowledge you do have. And then just for the other technical detail, the other interesting thing about why I think we can use this is that these are mental events and they're based on agreement. So it's the nature of the Speech Act that once it initiates the institutional fact, it is the case for that community, especially by law, regardless whether or not people are thinking about it today, tomorrow, whatever. It remains on the books, and it either has to be forgotten entirely because the civilization ends, or you have to explicitly undo it. So I think that's an interesting feature of it.
Any other questions of a non-technical nature? Okay, thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
Do I have a speaker? Adrian or Pedro? Edurne. Right. Go on, get up there. Yeah. All right. So Adorno will now give us a short presentation about the Cidoc CRM in Spanish.
Yep.
Rock and roll.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Yo soy Edurne Uriarte y vengo de la Dirección General de Repositorios Universitarios de la UNAM y he trabajado de manera personal con el doctor Pedro Ángeles del Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, una primera versión de traducción del Cidoc CRM en español. For the people who follow us online, my name is Edurne Uriarte and I work here at the National University. And with Dr. Pedro Ángeles, also from the UNAM, we've been working on a first draft of the Spanish translation for Cidoc CRM in Mexico. we decided that this conversation is going to be in Spanish because we need a dialogue with this CRM version and with a community that we want to build. So I will continue in Spanish. We translated parts of the presentation, so hopefully everyone will be able to follow us. Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo creo que lo primero que quisiera es presentar brevemente lo que es el Cidoc CRM para quienes no lo conocen. Es un modelo, no propiamente un estándar, pero sí un modelo común para, basado en una ontología. Es un modelo de información para representar, es una herramienta para representar, para modelar la información del patrimonio cultural, de una manera que nos permite acercar distintos sistemas y métodos que se generan en la documentación del patrimonio de una manera, en un lenguaje común que sea reutilizable y comprensible por las personas de distintas disciplinas. Esto implica a los programadores, a los generadores de conocimiento y también a otros usuarios, ¿no? Y por supuesto, es un lenguaje también común con las máquinas. Yo no puedo hacer una presentación general del modelo, pero sí quisiera recuperar 4 elementos importantes. El primero es que este es un modelo generado por el ICOM a partir de un grupo de interés y toda una comunidad de trabajo. Creo que el término comunidad de trabajo es muy importante y es un modelo estándar ISO. Quiere decir que tiene como un nivel, una jerarquía que le permite ser utilizado, ¿no? La segunda es que fue desarrollado por equipos interdisciplinarios de expertos. Eso también es muy importante. Es una comunidad y es interdisciplinaria. En campos de informática, de arqueología, de documentación, de museos, historia del arte, bibliotecas, filosofía, entre otras especialidades. Ese diálogo sería la segunda característica que me gustaría rescatar. El tercero es que es un modelo bottom-up. Bottom-up significa que va del análisis, de la toma de decisiones, de la identificación de problemáticas comunes desde abajo, desde las comunidades que están realizando el trabajo, hacia arriba, hacia la toma de decisiones hacia arriba, ¿no? Y el cuarto es el énfasis de la ontología formal, puesto en identificar y definir la semántica subyacente de los esquemas de bases de datos. Ese es el cuarto elemento que me parece muy importante, es decir, la historia del arte, el patrimonio cultural en general es muy diverso en objetos, en intenciones, en historias y también en las formas de documentar el conocimiento. Sin embargo, todos tienen elementos y problemáticas comunes. Entonces, CRM es un ejercicio muy interesante de documentar aquello que tenemos o que tienen en común. ¿Por qué traducir Cidoc CRM al español si los estándares son lenguajes comunes y en general se utilizan en inglés? Para nosotros, al hacer esta traducción, lo primero que entendimos es que es muy importante comprender el modelo y compartirlo con nuestras comunidades en nuestro idioma, que en la medida en la que tenemos la capacidad de dialogar en español, podemos interpretar, podemos entender también las problemáticas que dieron origen y las discusiones que pudieron llevarse a cabo para generar este modelo. La segunda es que pues partimos de un interés muy personal, Pedro y yo, pero deseamos empezar a generar grupos de interés relacionados con el patrimonio cultural y las nuevas tecnologías, sobre todo las tecnologías de la información. En tercer lugar, también queremos contribuir a mejorar las bases de datos del patrimonio cultural a partir de promover filosofías como LOD, Linked Open Data, y datos FAIR. FAIR significa, es un acrónimo en inglés para Findable, Accessible, Interoperable and Reusable. y consideramos que Cidoc CRM es una muy buena herramienta para discutir en estos términos. Y finalmente, que consideramos a nivel personal que es un nuevo campo y una oportunidad muy interesante de conocimiento para nuestras comunidades. Para discutir qué se preguntarán, para discutir el patrimonio cultural en muy distintos niveles, a nivel de bases de datos y modelos y ontologías, a nivel de estándares y vocabularios controlados y catálogos, a nivel de la documentación de las colecciones y los museos, cómo se realiza, para qué y qué tan compartible, intercambiable es. También para proveedores y agregadores de datos, como es el caso de la de Geru, donde yo trabajo, donde recuperamos información de distintas fuentes universitarias para integrarla en un modelo de datos homogéneo. Y en este sentido también para hablar sobre la interoperabilidad, en qué niveles nos estamos comunicando y a qué niveles podemos llegar también. Y finalmente para retos institucionales, porque detrás de todos estos temas, pues hay discusiones en las mesas de trabajo sobre presupuesto, sobre a quién contratamos, a quién no, para qué nos alcanza, para qué no, y con cuántos elementos contamos, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, en esta primera versión, nosotros empezamos en el 2021 con la pandemia, que teníamos un nuevo tiempo con el que no contábamos y decidimos empezar a analizar el modelo y a traducirlo y generar un documento de trabajo y de discusión. Esto de que es un documento de trabajo y de discusión para mí es muy importante porque nosotros no contamos propiamente todavía con una comunidad, la queremos generar. La comunidad está allá afuera, pero no nos conocemos quizá todavía. Entonces, por eso necesitábamos una traducción que no fuera la traducción más perfecta, pero sí un punto intermedio entre esas personas que les puede interesar, que se pueden acercar y empezar a generar esta comunicación. Elegimos la versión 7.1.1. Pues como estamos en el correo del SIG, nos enteramos del issue 528 y entonces a partir de ahí empezamos a buscar un poco más de información sobre sus lineamientos, normas y objetivos de traducción. Y en este documento de trabajo elegimos traducir la primera parte, la traducción, el Cidoc CRM está dividido en dos partes principales. La primera es una parte contextual, teórica, de información sobre los conceptos principales que están detrás del modelo, y la segunda parte son propiamente las propiedades y las entidades que lo componen. Entonces, tomamos la decisión de traducir la primera parte para tener un entendimiento común de las bases teóricas, filosóficas que están detrás de las entidades y propiedades. Y la segunda parte está traducida con una propuesta inicial nada más para poderla discutir con ese posible futuro nuevo grupo. En este momento hemos logrado algunos primeros resultados. El primero es un conocimiento personal. Conocemos un poco más el modelo, entendemos su potencial interdisciplinario en dos niveles. Por un lado, en el impacto que puede tener en nuestros procesos de trabajo, pero también en cómo estos procesos pueden llegar a un nivel que se pueden escalar y se pueden compartir con otras personas. La otra son las reflexiones que hemos podido tener sobre la documentación y las bases de datos. La tercera es que nos es un poco más sencillo comunicar el modelo y los principales, lo que consideramos nosotros los principales principios del modelo. Otro es el de pensar más allá de las bases de datos, porque los modelos que vienen a nuestra mente primero son en Access modelamos las tablas, los campos y demás, pero este modelo es un modelo que nos permite organizar la información a partir de un sentido más real de cómo se generó, ¿no? Y finalmente es que permite un diálogo fluido. Esta primera versión ya nos permitió dialogar con algunos colegas en América Latina, España y Portugal, pero también nos ha permitido ya empezar a dialogar con la comunidad del SIG, del Cidoc CRM, y eso nos ha traído muchos primeros también resultados. Entonces ya pudimos conversar con ellos en una primera reunión y como resultado de eso nos descubrimos con mucho agrado que tienen muchísimas templates, patrones, materiales que se pueden reutilizar y hemos empezado a tomar algunos. Por ejemplo, la primera parte la entregamos a algunos primeras personas que son nuestros primeros lectores, que ese ha sido un tema complicado, elegir quién tiene el tiempo, el interés, las ganas de leer esta primera parte y hacernos comentarios, ¿no? Y lo hicimos con estos materiales que nos dieron. La segunda es que la traducción francesa tiene un trabajo muy interesante en el GitHub que es reutilizable y nosotros estamos empezando a hacer nuestros propios ejercicios para tener allí la segunda parte que son todas las entidades y las propiedades para guardar registros y poder dialogar ya con quien se decida sumar a este esfuerzo. Y lo que sigue pues simplemente es seguir estudiando, generar esta sinergia que les comento al interior de la UNAM principalmente y en colaboración con otras instituciones externas, construir un grupo permanente ya sea como seminario, taller o laboratorio y formalizar nuestra relación con el grupo de interés, ¿no? de SIG for CRM. Y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Any questions? You're in a direct line.
Hola, buenas tardes. Me llamo Michelle Fuentes. Yo trabajo en un museo universitario de arqueología. Mi pregunta va en relación a que tú bien sabes que el INAH es el que también nos regula también esta parte del registro de la información. De hecho, ellos son los que validan el registro. Ahí ustedes, no sé si no entendí muy bien, es una plataforma en la cual también nosotros con este registro podemos jugar en esa plataforma, se están comunicando con el INAH, ¿qué pasa con ellos? Porque si no sería como el trabajo de cumplir al INAH y también hacer como esta parte, entonces dobletearíamos trabajo.
Perdón, sí, yo creo que tú te estás refiriendo a una nueva etapa del trabajo, que es ya cómo podemos implementar el modelo propiamente. Ahorita estamos en una fase pues de discusión sobre el modelo y de qué manera nos podemos apropiar de él. Creo que lo más importante de esta discusión es que podamos dialogar, que tengamos un instrumento común para el diálogo, aunque para las distintas partes, porque no es lo mismo un museo de arqueología que un museo de arte o un museo de colecciones biológicas. Cada uno va a tener necesidades diferentes y así como el INAH tiene sus reglas, también las colectas tienen sus problemas y también el INBA tiene sus requerimientos. Entonces, ahí creo que sería cosa de que te sumes a la conversación para empezar a integrar precisamente estas necesidades y de qué manera cuáles son nuestras cosas en común que tenemos, ¿no? CRM encontró esos elementos en común, vamos a ver qué tanto nos aplican a nosotros, ¿no? Sí, no sé.
Bueno, yo quería preguntar sobre la implementación, que ya más o menos has contestado.
Sí.
Pero, ¿en qué estado estáis ahora mismo en la traducción? O sea, si lo lleváis muy avanzado, no lo lleváis. Bueno, ¿cuál es un poco el roadmap que estáis pensando
Sí.
para principalmente la implementación, que creo que es el punto importante, porque la traducción, bien, ¿vale? Pero el paso es la implementación.
Claro, yo creo que la implementación ya requiere de un proceso de ya más maduración de exactamente qué quieres implementar, ¿no? Y la implementación va a depender de las personas que estén interesadas y de qué manera lo van a querer hacer. Nosotros tenemos una primera versión, logramos ese primer objetivo de tener una versión de trabajo para empezar a generar esta comunidad y empezar a encontrar soluciones entre todas las partes. Y que estéticas, por ejemplo, que va más avanzada con un modelo de implementación, decida, bueno, yo llego hasta este punto y después de tanto tiempo puedo dar el siguiente paso y después estoy en la web semántica, ¿no? No podemos, no vamos a ir de allí hasta la web semántica en un minuto, ¿no? Y en ese sentido nosotros estamos todavía en una fase muy inicial. De hecho, tomamos, no me apareció aquí, pero tomamos un taller con George Brusaker el fin de semana, our teacher Brusaker, que nos abrió todavía más la comprensión de cómo se modela el conocimiento, y eso es lo primero, entender muy bien cómo se modela para que las personas que se dedican a la gestión del conocimiento generen las bases de datos que se necesitan para que los implementadores y desarrolladores generen la información tecnológica como se necesita y que podamos entre todos tener un diálogo común, porque lo que sucede muchas veces ahora es que los computólogos se hablan entre ellos con sus cosas raras y los historiadores del arte están ahí hablando de su pintura rara y los coleccionistas de las colecciones biológicas están por allá hablando de sus bichos y justo lo que necesitamos es cómo entendemos todo esto como objetos del patrimonio cultural. Y thinking about George's presentation, when he's talking about the fact, we have this fact that this is objects of a cultural heritage, right? We all assume that that's what they are, and we have to share them.
Okay. I'm going to have to hold the questions there because we've got one more presentation to squeeze in. No, we're out of time. So Nick Croft will now give a presentation on the ICOM Handbook for Standards for Documenting African Collections. Is it still relevant today? Historic document re-explored.
Controlenlos para Maxi.
Thank you very much. So this is going to be a blast from the past. This is all about this document, which was published in 1995. How many people were alive here in 1995? Quite a few of us. Who was working in a museum in 1995? And who remembers this document being launched? Wow. I didn't think I'd get that many. 4 people. Well, we're in proud company. Okay, so this document, basically, this is, I think I'm going to put on my glasses. I managed to find them for once. Sorry? Yeah, it has. It's you know, more than a quarter of a century on. There is a photograph on the web somewhere of the two of us at that conference. I haven't put it in the presentation. You'll be pleased to know. Okay, so my name's Nick Crofts. I work in Geneva. I'm a consultant in informatics, heritage informatics. I've worked in lots of museums and places like that. Former chair of Cidoc. Terry Nyambe, unfortunately, can't be with us today. He's the curator of ichthyology at the Livingstone Museum in Zambia. And if you want to really annoy Terry, the thing to do is to say to him something like, "Oh, you're from the Livingstone Museum, I presume." That really gets his goat. Doesn't like that at all. So Terry and I have both served on the ICOM executive board for our paints. Terry's actually still on the executive board, although I understand getting a little bit fed up with it. Okay, so I wanted to tell you about this standard, which appeared in 1995. I started getting interested in this document, which had been sitting on my bookshelf since then, because in 2000, we ran a little workshop as part of the Cidoc conference in Geneva. And it was a workshop for participants from Africa. And one of the things that came up in that conference, in that discussion, was that they wanted some standards available online. And I said, well, you've got one. It was made for African museums. Why don't you use it? And it quickly became evident that hardly anybody had heard of it. So that was one thing. And then that was put on the list of action points for Cidoc. So that was one reason. And then I was talking about this with Terry, and he said he'd used it in the past. And so we wondered, why is it not very accessible? And indeed, there is a bit of a problem if you try to get hold of it. If you can find it on a few websites, it's not on the Cidoc website, but it is on the ICOM website. By the way, this is not live, and do not try this at home. If you get a message like this, it means back out. You are going somewhere dangerous. Your computer is about to be contaminated with a Trojan virus. So something like that. However, very courageously, I put this onto a safe machine and continued for you. And this is what the message, oh, it's not displaying it. Why is it not coming up? Next message, no. Oh, well, never mind. What it does display, if you get onto you force this through and you go through, there's a charming message in French, which said, "Ce document ne peut pas être vu depuis ici," which means basically, you're on the right track, doing well, and there might be a document, but the computer says no. You're not going to be allowed to see it. And there is a trick. You can get to see this document if you really want to. What you have to do is actually log on to the ICOM website as an ICOM member. So you need to have a password, which you can get from ICOM Secretariat. It takes about, I don't know how many months. Anyway, once you've got your passport, you can log on. You then go to the ICOM archives, and you then select library, not archives. And then you type in the name of the document, which you already know, of course. And then you're provided with a PDF copy of the document, which is, so you can get it. Technically, it's online. And if you want to know why it's so inaccessible, ask Julian Anfrans, who was the General Secretary of ICOM for a while. Because the document is now effectively inaccessible, doesn't respect any of the rules for accessible documentation, it means it's not visible to search engines like Google and so on. So it's very difficult to get hold of. Although if you're, as I said, if you're really insistent, you can get to it. All right, a little, come along. Next slide, here we are, a little bit of background, okay. And, missing a slide there. So, this is the AFRICOM. AFRICOM was a program started up by ICOM in 1991. They ran a series of what they call encounters. This is very, you remember ICOM is based in Paris. So they had these encounters, rencontres, called What Museums for Africa Heritage in the Future? And they took place in Benin, Ghana, and Togo over a series of years. And then out of that came an affiliated organization. ICOM handed over the work of this organization, AFRICOM. It means Africa ICOM, in case you hadn't guessed. They handed over the work to a regional alliance and a conseil. And then finally, it's turned into ICOM Africa, I think. So it's quite a big structure, and ICOM originally put in quite a lot of effort into this project. And it wasn't just about making this document. It was about, there was a repertoire, a directory of African professionals and workshops on illicit traffic and all kinds of activity. And this was just one activity amongst others. It wasn't funded by ICOM, it was funded by a constellation of funding bodies. 11 of them, as far as I can tell. And if you want me to read out the names, I'm not going to, but you can ask me afterwards. So this was, as I said, this was just one of the projects that they had going. 6 pilot museums, you can see the names here, took part in this work. There were meetings in each of these museums. There were then 3 meetings in Paris, people going all over the place. The work took 4 or 5 years. I'm not quite sure exactly how long. And then they came up with 1, 2, and then finally this was the 3rd version. And this is the one that was published. And it was launched to great fanfare at the ICOM, the Cidoc conference, which took place in Nairobi in 1995. Is that right? 1996. Yeah, so this was at that conference. And we actually had the presence of the ICOM president there, Sarosh Ghosh, who attended our meeting. So we were quite honored to have him there. If you like, you can have a look at this rare historical document. I would like to get it back. So, comparison with 2 other documents that exist. I've got this thing here, which is, as you can see now, extremely tatty, much used document. This is the Cidoc International Guidelines for Museum Objects that was being prepared and published, was published in June 1995. And there's another document which is the Getty Object ID. Now, the Cidoc Guidelines has 96 fields in it. Object ID has just 11, because Object ID is like a passport. It focuses on what data you need to be able to identify an object. If you're, say, somebody working, a policeman working somewhere, Interpol use it. The Cidoc Guidelines are intended to allow a museum to fulfill its function. So it's the minimum data necessary for a museum to be able to do its job properly, fulfilling. The AFRICOM handbook has 56 fields in it, so quite a lot less than the Cidoc guidelines. There are a few fields that overlap that aren't in any of that are only in the AFRICOM handbook. They're about archaeological sites and other unimportant details. Yeah, no, actually, they're about very important details about archaeological sites, and they really should be in the Cidoc guidelines. And then there are about 31 fields that are not in the AFRICOM handbook, which is a bit of a mistake. These fields that are not in the AFRICOM handbook, they're important things like deaccessioning information, location history, metadata about the provenance of the information, who put it in and when did they update it, that sort of thing. This is non-trivial data. It's very important for a museum to run properly. But still, in spite of that, you might be thinking that I'm trying to say that this book is not very good. However, I think it does compare quite favorably with the other 2 documents, mainly because it includes terminology, and it also includes lots of very helpful illustrations based on objects that people would have been familiar with. Some problems with this document. One is the complex presentation. As you can see, if you're looking at it, it's very difficult to photocopy. partly because of the format of the paper, but also because of the typography. And there were no reprints after the first one. And that, I think, probably stopped it being distributed as much as it might have been. It's very, very ambitious. One of the things, this is one of the authors, I'm quoting her, she said it was going to do all the things for an inventory that you'd expect, but that was then going to eradicate trafficking, illicit trafficking of African heritage. Personally, I can't see, I mean, maybe you can, but I can't see how an inventory, however good, can stop illicit trafficking. Might slow it down a bit, but people got disappointed, I suspect. But then there's a question of financial support as well. No software was offered. This was a purely manual standard. However, in spite of all these problems, there is a more positive way of looking at things. We conducted a survey, Terry and we found that although the younger generation have never heard of it, the older generation had. And they told us that they had used it for building their systems. The documentation systems in use today in a lot of African museums are based on this standard. The standard, in other words, has become the foundations which have been buried and forgotten, but the legacy is still there. This means it's an interesting possibility. We need to conduct a proper survey to check this. It may be that the quality of the metadata in the museum documentation is better than you would expect. In other words, more systematic terminology and more systematic structure. And that could lead us to some important possibilities. Conclusions. Is this document worth keeping or not? On balance, I think yes. One, it's got historical value. This is an important, if slightly embarrassing, period in ICOM's history. And I think just as an archival document, it really ought to be made more accessible. Secondly, it's an important model. It shows a period when ICOM was funding activity from Cidoc directly. The president of ICOM, of Cidoc, sorry, Andrew Roberts, and the vice chair took part in this work. And there was a lot of activity being funded by ICOM and funding bodies. And that's a model for cooperation, which we don't see so much these days. But I think it's a useful model, and it's worth remembering that it's possible. And possibly this could be a core standard for integration for a new project. And if you'd be interested in talking about that possibility with me, I can promise to bribe you with some chocolate, porque nada es mejor que el chocolate suizo. And this is Swiss chocolate I brought with me. I don't have it here now. Anyway, so that's me done. If you have been, thank you for listening. And I'm willing to answer some questions. Thank you.
So any questions for Nick before we go for lunch? Please note that I have mentioned lunch to make sure that everybody keeps their questions short.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. And I have to mention that I was there also at the Cidoc in Nairobi. The standard has worked well for African museums, but as you are mentioning it, mainly as a manual that really helped because of the challenges with funding to get systems. But my question is whether there is possibility for, is it review? Is it what you're calling integration? Because I'm thinking that there is a working group, I don't know whether the chair is here, for ICH in Cidoc. And something that's been a challenge has been the incorporation of ICH into, I think, many museum standards, not just the AFRICOM standard. So I was just thinking that there's already a working group here, perhaps within Cidoc, that you can work with and to improve the standard, because it's really been the best that there has been. If I am allowed to use the term decolonization, perhaps we thought about it many years ago before we even adopted the term. So thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. As you said, the first thing we need to do is a proper survey to see what the situation is like. The survey we did was very informal. Basically, Terry was phoning up his friends, which works. You know, you get some good, useful information, but it's not systematic and it's not covering everything. I'm hoping we might be able to get some funding from ICOM to set that up, just to get things rolling. After that, I think a lot of projects, if we want to do something ambitious, you need to have some fireworks. And I think that's why I started talking about something like an integration project, because that's the sort of high profile project which can attract funding from funding bodies. And that's what we would need to do. Unfortunately, you know, the funding for all the heavy lifting, the grunt work, it's very difficult to get that.
Hi, nice to meet you all. My name is Kiat Sakaridis. I work for an NGO situated in Belgium, working on intangible heritage. And I'm not at all the chair of the working group that you refer to, but together with my other colleague, Sergio Servion from ICOM Belgium Founders, we have been working on standards for and guidelines, etc., on intangible cultural heritage. And I also read your article from 13 years ago on this topic. So I'll be happy to exchange thoughts and discuss further. And we're also presenting the work that we have been doing in Founders, but that we want to open up to other people from all around the world on a Thursday. So welcome to join.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have something to say?
Just to say about follow up again about intangible heritage. It's clear this document was published long before there was an explicit discussion about intangible heritage. In fact, the term hadn't even been coined yet. We were still talking about folk art and so on, or traditional art. And it's a particular interest of mine. So yeah, I think there's room this document. It's a good starting point, but it needs to be brought up to date. And there's a lot to be done. I mean, I pointed out a few of the shortcomings, but I think we can improve on this. But it is a good starting point, and it potentially puts African museums and African collections outside Africa in an interesting place. There's trying to integrate data across Europe, for instance. There's no standards, no common data standards, no common vocabulary. It's an absolute nightmare. And Europeana has, you know, all along the project, it's suffered from that. And here, this would be a possibility for African museums to do something qualitatively much better, and probably at lower cost as well.
Thank you very much.
Right.
So just to round off the session with thanking our speakers and perhaps a spot of luncheon.
Sorry, just one comment. We come back at 4 for the next table, and food will be served at the MUAC. Entonces vamos a comer en el MUAC y regresamos a las 4. Gracias.
Going